Halo 3 LASO is even harder than Halo 2 LASO.
I don't even know if it's actually possible.
Honestly, I have no... Oh my god.
Are you kidding? That was so good!
There's no way he killed me!
What?
A lot of Halo fans already know that the hardest difficulty across all of Halo is Legendary All Skulls On, where the game must be played on the hardest difficulty with all of these modifiers that make the game even more challenging than what it initially is. But over the summer, we saw Moist Critical present a challenge to complete Halo 2 LASO completely deathless without the Envy Skull, one of the modifiers. And the first person to do it would win $20,000. Now this was completed by streamer Javalen after about 40 days, being the first player to ever do this, but it sparked a lot of interest across the Halo community to see who would be the first to pull this same challenge off in a different Halo title, specifically Halo 3. And I'll be honest, when it comes to this one, nobody expected Halo 3 LASO Deathless to be as difficult as it actually is. Let me explain. Halo 2 LASO and Halo 3 LASO are very different, and if you are playing through both LASOs casually, where you are allowed to die, consensus typically is that Halo 2 is way harder. I don't think anybody really expected though when it came to Halo 3, adding in the deathless factor, thus removing any trial and error strategies, would make the difficulty of this challenge immediately amplified, bringing it all the way up to the same level of Halo 2 LASO, if not even harder.
Honestly, I think it might be harder. In fact, I think it's harder. You got Catch and Black Eye go from, like, arguably helping you in Halo 2 to being the worst skulls in Halo 3. They're absolute nightmares. I think it's harder.
You see, in Halo 3 LASO, Master Chief essentially is a glass cannon. While he can shoot and kill some enemies a little bit easier than the enemies that you face off in Halo 2, Master Chief can be melted incredibly quickly with close to no time to react. Furthermore, in Halo 2, there are several sound and visual cues that can help you figure out how much shield you have left at any given moment, or when your shield is depleted, for example, but Halo 3 doesn't have the same types of indications, making it much harder to see how much health you really have. Other than being able to maybe hear a subtle sound of a shot and be able to discern the sound of impacts between maybe the ground or actually Master Chief, and very minimal visual cues, you're left playing through Halo 3 literally without much indication to how you're doing shield and health wise. And while Halo 2 had its own rule set for which skulls to have activated, Halo 3 has a completely different set of skulls when it comes to LASO. Let's look at the skulls that are required for Halo 3 before jumping into what goes on in this actual run. First is the Black Eye Skull, which makes it where shields only recharge if you punch enemies. The Blind and Fog Skull remove all of your HUD, so good luck aiming. Catch makes it so enemies throw more grenades. Famine has it so that weapons dropped by AI have half the ammo. Mythic and Thunderstorm give the enemies double health and upgrades a lot of the enemy ranks, where Tilt and Cowbell make it so that the enemy resistance and weaknesses are increased while also having accelerated object velocity. And then there's Tough Luck, which makes it so that enemies always go berserk, always dive out of the way, and will never flee. Also, I Would Have Been Your Daddy and Grunt Birthday are on, though they don't affect the gameplay, and obviously neither does Iron since this is a deathless challenge. Now, in the past, we've talked a little bit about Thesis, who essentially was the top contender for being able to pull this off. While Javalen was the first player to beat Halo 2 LASO Deathless on both OG Xbox and MCC, Thesis and Frazier are the only two other players to beat Halo 2 LASO Deathless, and now both have been going on the grind learning Halo 3, along with some other players who threw their hats into the ring as well, like Sorix and Sasquatch Sensei. But the daily grind and deep runs Thesis was consistently getting was making fans optimistic that maybe Halo 3 would be completed quickly. But with some massive obstacles in the second half of the game, completion wouldn't be something that could be easy for literally anyone. Let's go level to level and look at the Halo 3 LASO Deathless run and what it entails. Sierra 117 is an interesting level. It shows you no mercy going into this. You kind of have like cold water dumped on you, as you have to learn that the Covenant is definitely pretty aggressive in this game. Sticky grenades, jackal snipers, you get brutes that have just the best aim with their brute shot. It's pretty wild. There's a lot of things that can go wrong here. Now, we have seen some players route out different types of paths outside of the map to avoid some enemies, and you also want to make sure you get a Cortana dialogue skip, as if Cortana spawns in, there's a chance it'll despawn the Arbiter, and you kind of want to have him with you when you're fighting enemies enemies because he can just take a ton of damage and there's no penalty for that. Also, these jackals in the forest can randomly spawn, and the only way you're going to be able to navigate this is if you just memorize all of the potential spawns where they can spawn in, or you're just going to end up being surprised. You might also run into how crazy some of the grenade throws that grunts and brutes can do actually are in Halo 3 with the Catch Skull. These throws can be absolutely wild, and sometimes you only have a split second to react to a grenade throw, and that's just something that comes with a little bit of timing and practice. Also, the end section can be a little bit wild, and we've seen Thesis play this end section quite a bit, and it just seems like something that you get good at the more you practice it and you become familiar with what you need to do to actually clear this part out. You just have to watch out for some angry brute chieftains sometimes. Now, if you didn't get good at dodging grenades on Sierra 117, Crow's Nest will make sure that you learn how to dodge grenades, because these things in these tighter corridors go wild. These grenade throws are crazy, and you have to just be able to jump away at a split second. The hangar section can be incredibly annoying because a lot of the times the weapons that you normally would be able to use at your disposal will just randomly despawn. There's something weird with the way that Halo 3 works, where weapons that are not being held by a player can just randomly despawn even if you just held them a moment earlier. So that's another big concern, and you can potentially run out of ammo altogether here. And also, this level just throws a lot of enemies at you in close corridors, so Crow's Nest definitely isn't a walk in the park. Learning the Chieftain AI is probably one of the harder parts of Crow's Nest, as in most cases, if you want to get a good backsmack to clear this as easily as possible, you kind of have to know how he works here. We've seen Thesis have to navigate through this level several times, and it gets pretty wild at times. He has to make sure he's avoiding random things like trip mines or melees from brutes with the jetpacks, but if you can get off Crow's Nest, things definitely start to heat up. Now, real quick, we don't have a sponsor for this video, so if you like our content and you want to support us and you think that there is some quality content on this channel, make sure you do check out our Patreon, link in the description down below. You could get your name in the credits of our video, and that's really cool. And the money we get to Patreon helps both Luke and I, survive off of these videos. I also am recording this with the flu, and once we get our Patreon money, I can go and buy some cold medicine, so that would be nice. So yeah, Patreon link down below. Okay, let's go ahead and look at Savo Highway, because now things are starting to heat up. You can easily get melted on Savo Highway if you're not careful with how you drive your Warthog and try to avoid the enemies that you don't have to take on, and there's a lot of random things that can happen along the way, and some parts where it sometimes feels like it's just luck to get through, but for the most part, Thesis got really good at clearing the first half of this level. It's really the back half of the level where trouble starts to arise. These brutes and choppers show no mercy, and they can just automatically spin around and melt the Master Chief quicker than anything that we've seen. Also, the choppers have a tendency to just like boost around, and occasionally you might just get boosted into and explode and get splattered instantly. That's never a fun feeling. Now, there are a couple of interesting tricks you can do to try to bypass this level a little bit easier with some despawns, and while you can clear this level quickly by clearing out the shade turret and breaking the shield at the end, it's actually safer for Thesis to stay back and just shoot slowly all of the brutes and kill them from a distance than it would be for him to risk getting too close, just because of how dangerous this section is. Now, early on when Thesis first attempted this challenge, the first 3 levels kind of a walk in the park for him. It wasn't until he got to the Storm where Halo 3 really starts to intensify. From the Storm forward, you're going to start to realize why many people started to realize this challenge is close to impossible. On the Storm, we see Thesis keeps the Warthog right away so that the Marines don't go wreck it as soon as possible, and he lets the rest of the Marines run in there and die or kill whatever they can, while he stays back picking things off. After this, he brings the Warthog up and parks it just right so that the Marine on the back can use the turret and help take out the enemies in the longer hallway. This is actually a really cool strategy here. After he's able to clear that section, he goes down in the hallway and grabs this bubble shield, which will be useful later, and moving forward, the outdoor area in this level is an absolute mess. There's a lot of things driving around that can quickly kill you, there's enemies in all sorts of directions, and there's just a lot of easy ways to lose your health and die here. Thesis then switches to a ghost here and drives around the inner part of the outdoor section, avoiding all of this traffic and chaos happening until he can get to the big door section where you would normally leave this area from and fight a bit from a distance a little more safely. He'll actually hide in a crate when the Covenant drops off a Wraith, which he will then EMP and hijack using a frame perfect trick to get access to the Wraith, which will then be used to kill everything else in the area at a distance, safely safely where he won't get killed. This next part, he just moves through the interior quickly, just picking off a few enemies early on, and heads down the hallway to the next outdoor part where there's a bunch of Marines with mongooses and rockets. He takes a mongoose up the left side of the outdoor area and gets to the upper level, shooting down at enemies occasionally, and uses missile pods to help out on the ghosts and wraiths that are in the area. Now the scarab part is kind of scary. There's a lot of enemies who can quickly wreck you, and Thesis juggles plasma pistols up the elevator and clears many of these enemies early on before eventually boarding the scarab to take it out. Now this indoor section where you're kind of inside of this factory area is actually an incredibly challenging part. There's a lot of enemies and you have to be pretty calculated with how you approach this part. So we see Thesis juggling in plasma pistols here, but his gun ends up despawning, of course. So now he just has to sit here and wait. After the Arbiter and some of the Marines kind of clear a little bit of the room, Thesis is able to run through the next room in a precise route, and he uses the bubble shield once he gets to the outdoor section to shield and avoid enemies shooting at him from behind, which also allows him to glitch out of bounds and wrap around to the end part, avoiding a lot of these fights you have in these alleyways. From there, while avoiding enemies where he can, he uses plasma pistols to spam shots at the AA gun, which is the fastest way to take the weapon out, and then he clears this level and takes a quick lunch break before continuing on to Floodgate. You know, during this time he sits back, talks to his chat, usually checks up on other streamers like Jervalen just to see what's up, but before he wastes too much time, he's jumping back in and is ready to take on Floodgate. Now Floodgate already has a reputation of being one of the easier LASO levels, but of course when you're on a deathless marathon like this, you have to be careful that you don't end up dying anyways. There are a few things that can still go wrong despite this being one of the safest and shortest LASO levels in all of Halo. For the most part, you kind of just run through things, but there are sections which can run a risk of Chief randomly getting spotted early where he can die, and the part towards the end can get a little bit dangerous, but if you know your specific route, you can just bypass a lot of the fights, and in some of the fights where you do have to get involved, you can rely on your elite allies, like in this one hallway, where they're kind of helpful too. Otherwise, the main goal is just to keep moving and don't die, and get to the end and also not die, and this level can be completed. But after all of that, we now get to the big three: the Ark, the Covenant, and Cortana. 3 levels that each are complex in their own way. Some are longer, and some have a lot of different strats you have to utilize, and some of the enemies are just more brutal than anything else. These levels make up a majority of the real challenge that is here. Man, heck, the Ark alone for a while was one level that most people couldn't even get past. Let alone the fact that the Ark, the Covenant are both pretty lengthy levels, and Cortana is going to be an incredibly challenging level. This is just the very beginning of where things really start to get spicy here. Now, it did take Thesis a while to have a strategy to even get through Ark, but when you look at how Thesis kind of came up with a strategy to get through this level, you can actually see that it's a pretty complex route that is very calculated in how everything must go to have this level cleared as smoothly as possible. At the very first part of the Ark, Thesis takes a few quick shots on the enemies by the tower, alerting the rest of the enemies. He then quickly moves down to the rocks closer to the structure's outer wall, and then jumps onto that wall and sneaks around most of the enemies while they're pushing the Marines that Thesis had been standing by when he initially started the attack. This can get him over to the second set of enemies, where he takes out a few enemies up top, and then once again moves down by the lower structure. This time he waits around for the enemies to take the bait and move up in the direction where he initiated the attack, and after he waits for a bit, he has a little window where he can slide by some of the enemies and just have to worry about picking off a few that are still in his way, hurrying up to the ridgeline to the top of the hill. Once he gets inside, he's safe for a moment. Also, by doing this strat, it helps Thesis preserve ammo, and since he's limited on how much ammo he has, where he can use them, and then also what ammo he has left on the enemies in the next open area, by him avoiding some of these fights allows him to have a little bit extra going into the next set of fights. And there's quite a bit of enemies in this area that he has to pick off kind of meticulously. Once he does clear the area, he has to be very careful with how much damage he takes during this, but he can move down and grab a rocket launcher, which will come in handy a little bit later. The next biggest challenge or threat is these prowlers, which then pull up. Thesis will back off behind a rock and pick them off, keeping his distance, and some of the time during all this, his health can be really low. So it can get really intense because just one wrong movement or one shot that isn't expected can put this run all the way back to Sierra. Once he's able to clear out this next part, he uses the rockets on these brutes before they can jump into the chopper and use it against him, and his homie Marines will jump in a prowler and move into the next area, which definitely helps divert the attention of some of the enemies, and they also can help take out enemies as well. There is another chopper that will push at Thesis, and he has to take the driver out as he will need this chopper later, but with the help of the Marines, it is something that is possible. This chopper actually ends up being a beast at long range. Sure, it can take a long time to actually kill some of the enemies, but it's the most reliable option here when it comes to taking out enemies, as you have infinite ammo and a decent chunk of range so you can keep your distance. After this part, he switches to a ghost to let his Marines in the prowler move up and take out the enemies in the upper pathways, and then he parks outside this cave before grabbing another chopper to shoot at all of the enemies in the next open area. Now this part will definitely take a while, but hey, it works and it's a safe strategy because you don't want to die this far into a run. After about 15 minutes of killing everything, Thesis then climbs up on the rocks here. Why, you may ask? Because he doesn't want to get splattered by some random debris, and even if it's a very low chance of happening, and it's something that most players don't experience in a playthrough, it's better to be safe than sorry. But after all of that, we do get a little bit of a fun, yet careful tank ride. You don't want to get wrecked by anything, so staying back safe is definitely the way to go. Unfortunately, the next part of this level does run you into some maximum chaos, and if you don't have the right strats, there's a high likelihood you won't clear the back half of the arc. Even an experienced player like Thesis had to work out strategies for even a chance of survival. So strategy A that is implemented here, Thesis tries to encourage the Covenant to move out of his way. Strategy B, this area right here, we're going to call this the safety rock, and he parks back here and blasts the legs slowly until the Scarab is down, where he can then board and take out the battery before running off. Strategy C sometimes doesn't go to plan, but essentially you want to still be able to use your tank after the Scarab to take out the remaining enemies in the area, though sometimes your Marines aren't, all on board with the same strategies you're working on. From there, Thesis then goes out of bounds to avoid fighting the enemies on this staircase area, though he has to be careful to make sure he hits the spawn to cause the Pelican to fly in, but as long as he does that, he can jump in, and he juggles a ton of weapons to use in the next part of the level because he's going to need to use all the firepower that he can get. The first part indoors isn't all that bad. You can kind of sneak away, and there's some few interesting stealth parts that you have here, but then when you get outside and you hit the button, things definitely get a little bit more chaotic. In this case, Thesis had to literally fight his way downstairs, and things can get really hairy here in this last little bit. It's close quarters, but there's long corridors, so if Thesis takes damage, he's going to have a really hard time regenerating his health by trying to get close enough to melee some of the enemies. As he pushes down, you can see Thesis utilizing different strategies behind cover to take out enemies strategically. He will hit them with a plasma pistol and then pop off with a BR, and this seems to work most of the time. Sometimes he does some Ferrari peeking around corners to just pick off enemies where he can. The final fight at the end has to be taken completely slowly and methodically, but in the case of this specific run, we were seeing some really good progress here by Thesis, and the run we're looking at right now, Thesis ended up being faced with something that may have caused his entire run to fall apart right before his eyes. Yeah, one of these brutes ended up getting stuck outside of the map, which if Thesis can't kill him, the game is essentially over, and he has to start all the way back over at the very start. He can't backtrack up the level as the doors behind him will auto-lock, but fortunately enough, the brute did come down, and eventually Thesis was able to kill him, moving on and finally completing the arc. Next though was the Covenant. So on the Covenant, if you don't know what you're doing, survival chances are low. Thesis ended up coming up with a pretty good route. Early on, he walks alongside the water to avoid this massive firefight where just a ton of stuff is going on and it can be really dangerous, and then wraps around and uses a Spartan laser to fight off a Banshee and also fight from the front of the beach because killing the main enemies is a little bit easier, and while he could skip ahead, waiting for the Hog does keep things a little bit safer moving forward. When the Warthog does drop in, he hides behind it to take out the enemies that are up on the hill and uses the Marines as extra help to get into a ghost, and then things start to get interesting. Instead of heading to the first tower basin area, he actually goes up the cliff wall and ghost clips through an invisible barrier, then carefully falls inside the backside of the basin area over by the first tower. This lets him bypass the Prowler loads and avoid most of the big enemies in that outer area. From there, Thesis carefully pushes up the elevator, has this scary brute fight where he has to hang back and use plasma pistols the best that he can, and then has to carefully exit the tower while not dying. And things can get a bit dicey here, but the next part of the level is really cool. So he moves up forward, gets to the Hornet part, and this is where he can pretty much use the Hornet and keep a distance and take the safest route, which usually doesn't result in a death.
I just pushed a box into the... God, I looked the Rager message and I got hit by the Fuel Rod AA Rafe, dude. Oh my.
Otherwise, the main strategy here is to fly back, pick off stuff from a distance, and slowly kill the enemies out. The final tower that you have to go through is a little bit of a weird situation. Typically, you want to use these boxes to have some extra cover to hide from the enemies and use your elite allies for help. But this can also be kind of scary. It seems like if the rest of the elites are dead, it's just up to the Arbiter to protect you. And for whatever reason, Thesis kept having it where the Arbiters would try to lead the hunters to him, which sometimes would get too close for comfort. But from there, Thesis was able to head up, do the next little brute fight, and trigger the tower, which causes the Flood to come in. The Flood like to yeet themselves at Thesis. He makes his way out, uses the tank to clear out some of the enemies, and then mixes up the strategy significantly. After clearing the way, Thesis switches back to a ghost again. And while this next strat is a little bit confusing, we'll do the best that we can to explain it. Some of you may remember all the way back when we did a video on beating this level without using a Hornet. We manipulated load zones and traveled in and out of bounds to get to where we needed to go without using the actual Hornet. And essentially in this next area, Thesis uses this ghost here and does the same trick that we had did in one of our videos, but in reverse. And he loads from the end section of the level outwards back into the previous section, navigating the out of bounds section, and then heads back in bounds in the late section of this level. It looks confusing, and it kind of is.
You can die going out of bounds right there, like where I was just at. You can blow up your ghost and get killed. It's like, I don't know how to explain it. You have to go out in the wrong spot. Yeah, no, there's not really any chance of dying there. Like, unless you just do it wrong, but I'm not gonna do it wrong.
Now, when he drops back in, the load sequence of the level is completely disrupted, which can lead to some things loaded in weirdly or just different than normally. Like, there's no music, and this door is now partially open, meaning that the player can fly past the scarabs and just go inside. For the rest of this level, it's more just slow play and calculated fighting from a distance and not rushing things, clearing your way towards the Prophet with another slow and careful fight on the way out, which is how a completed Covenant run would look like. Now, in a previous video, we talked about how Thesis had managed to make it to the level Cortana 3 different times. But let's hone in on Thesis a little bit, who's been putting in a daily grind on this and currently has the furthest completion so far at the time of recording this, making it to Cortana 3 times. Cortana is by far the hardest part of this whole challenge, the grave mind of Halo 3, if you will. And Thesis, while being a great player, had his runs end when faced with this level time and time and time again. So what happened? Cortana is one of those levels where things can be going perfectly, and in a split second, all of a sudden your run is dead before you even had a second to think how to react.
Dude, I knew it. No. Why does he have to be there? No.
That right there was Thesis's third attempt on Cortana, and it was ripped away just like that. But let's look at the other two runs before, as we get a bigger picture of what's going on here. Prior to Thesis getting to Cortana, the furthest he had ever reached was Covenant, so this was new territory at the time, but Cortana very quickly showed that flood tanks don't mess around.
No, are you kidding? What killed me? I made it through, dude. What killed me? I was on the other side. Why did there have to be the pure form blocking the doorway, bro?
And honestly, his second run here didn't go that much better either.
Yeah, that's why it's scary. I have to go up there and get bubble shield.
So why is Cortana so hard? You might think that the tight corridors are maybe the main challenge, but it seems like in some cases, the areas that have wide open parts where enemies can swarm and just gun the chief down can be equally as threatening. Some of the long hallways can still be scary, though, especially if there are a lot of enemies ahead or behind that once again can shoot you while you're busy taking out enemies in the close quarters. And the close quarter enemies don't mess around either. This level completely shreds. So last we left Thesis, he had made it to Cortana 3 times just to have his runs cut short. And this level clearly isn't going to where just the right amount of routing will be enough to make this level beatable. Sure, planning out stuff is good, essential even, but this level strongly combines the need for pure skill, instant reflexes, along with a good strategy if making it even to the midway part of this level would even be possible. So after those 3 losses, Thesis was back on Sierra 117 again, and had to grind through each level once again without dying. Sometimes things would go wrong and he would die early, needing to go back to Sierra 117 again. However, it was one November night where Thesis was having an exceptionally good run. He made it to Covenant, the vibes and the energy were good, he was heading into the end part of the level and...
What? How? What?
Thesis exploded. Yeah, somehow a scarab shot clipped through the door and the blast radius also clipped through the door, killing him. That's some bad luck. Thesis was on the grind hard though, and wouldn't let that just stop him or discourage him. His next deep run made it to the Arc at a bit of a faster pace than usual even. His clear through Covenant was very clean as well, and as he navigated through the end parts of the level, flying the Hornet into the door, making sure this time to not die to the scarab, he was able to clear the end of this level carefully and oh shit, he has another run that's made it to Cortana. He might actually make it here. Now early on the level Cortana, this room by the Pelican can be incredibly hard with the number of enemies ahead in the area, and though in this specific instance Thesis was having a decent streak, managing to bypass dying here, despite the fact that this room had shown to be really risky in some practice runs, this room still would be a massive challenge for any runner who could manage to get this far. Fortunately, during some of the practice sessions that Thesis had, one viewer who had been watching Thesis every step of the way had an idea that could maybe work to help this room be easily cleared. And this is where the longtime Halo fan Fartinbutt came into play. For a while, Fartinbutt had already played a role theory crafting other strategies and LASO runs, but his contribution in this specific run could be a game changer. Familiar with other runs of Halo 3 that other players have done, FNB made the suggestion of utilizing a practice of baiting the enemies in and utilizing something like a distraction grenade to pull the flood away to where they need to be so that Thesis could then optimize his survival past this part. That would be a really big strategy if this could work. Also, during this time, a pretty big discovery was made. In this kind of big open room, there's a ton of enemies that just completely can destroy a runner at any given moment. By juggling 2 camos together, you can pull and bait the enemies a specific way, then double up on the second camo and get around without getting just immediately murdered, essentially making a pathway. This was a pretty big breakthrough. So going into this 4th run, fans were pretty hopeful that Thesis might have what it takes to finally get far into this level and maybe finally clear this thing once and for all. Going on in this level, things were going really well. The tricks had worked, and Thesis was even improvising to little nuanced things that would pop up along the way that might have been different than normal. For the first time ever, Thesis actually had made it into this big open generator room right before he goes to see Cortana. And would this be the run where we would finally see Thesis?
What? Dude, he bugged his animation!
Okay, so this guy's animation bugged, which allowed Chief to die despite the fact that the enemy hadn't swung like he's normally required to get the kill. Well, back to Sierra. Things would be a little rough after that last loss, but 13 days ago to the time that I'm recording this, Thesis did what was thought to maybe be impossible. After navigating through another run from the beginning and making his way through a pretty difficult opening, Thesis had finally made his way back to the generator area, and even was able to push his way around and make his way into the room where he gets Cortana. From this point, things are actually going. He had a chance here. He was quickly moving moving to take out enemies that were threatening and avoiding the long-ranged enemies where he needed to. He opened up the generators and got those blasting. Things were going well, and at this point, Thesis just had to make an escape. And this happened.
Yep.
This stupid panel somehow centered in the hallway and then cannoned down from the force of an explosion, hitting Master Chief and killing him. This doesn't usually happen, ever. Matter of fact, many Halo vets who were in the chat watching this stream at the time when this happened agreed that this is an incredibly rare occurrence. Some even going as far as saying that it's a 1 in a million thing that could happen. Unlucky Thesis again, and back to Sierra. Okay, but for real, 5 solid attempts. It would be a few nights before Thesis managed to get a deep run going again. Once again, he clears out the early sections, grinding through, avoiding the dangers. Okay, the hallway looks mostly safe, even if that panel was a little bit sussy. Thesis literally has this level down. He just needs to make a run to the end. He has health. He can actually do this, and
Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. Why? Dude, oh my god. Why me? Why me?
I'm not fully sure what to call this. Something with the hitbox of the flood killing him, but just not the best outcome. Everyone was pretty confident that Thesis had what it takes. This is now his 7th time going through a playthrough all the way up to Cortana, and this run was off to a good start. And as he's going through, just bam, randomly right here, there's a ton of enemies here and he gets overwhelmed. All right. Run number 8. This is such an interesting run this time around. He starts off with a very clean opening, adjusting to any little variables that are kind of weird along the way, like some enemies clustering up in an area. At this point, Thesis is very familiar with this level. He makes his way deep into High Charity, saving Cortana and hitting the engines on his way out. There was a little run-in with this one elite flood that was chasing him, which was really terrifying for a while, but he did manage to backsmack it with the sword, surviving it. Okay, run's not dead yet. Thesis continues pushing forward. But then in this next tight hallway, usually what Thesis does is he is able to just easily bait one enemy in a time, or sometimes he can just navigate around this without having to face enemies. But for whatever reason, 2 enemies come running out at Thesis at the same time. And unfortunately, there's really not much that Thesis could do here. So once again, wait, I don't know. Thesis is somehow still alive and pushing forward and managed to get his shields back up because of the Black Eye Skull and meleeing them. At this point, all Thesis has to do is just get out of High Charity and he can maybe have a shot at the last level. But honestly, at this point, there's been so much bad luck. It's like this level just does not, for the life of it, want to let Thesis beat it after 8 attempts here. Nonetheless, Thesis is pushing forward. He's in the last little stretch, maybe just a minute or 2 away. He goes into that hallway that he had been to before.
Look at that panel, dude! Oh my god, that panel!
This panel almost killed Thesis, but he survived. I think it was the fact that he knew there was this like minuscule chance from a previous run that this panel could hit him, and he was able to sidestep backwards. So Thesis moves forward, and then Cortana was cleared, meaning there was just one single level left to go, Halo. First things first, Thesis moves up through the level, avoiding a bunch of enemies, and does a quick grenade jump to get to the upper area, then wraps around and does another special jump, making his way up to the top, where he then climbs up to where Johnson is. Unfortunately, he's gonna have to take out Johnson 2 times to get Johnson's special unlimited Spartan laser, and from there, he will play it safe up here on this ridgeline, shooting at the flood, being careful that the flood doesn't actually hit him, because the flood can gun you down really quick from a long range. Fortunately, this part isn't the most impossible, so once he's able to clear this area out, he can head back down, head inside, and do the boss fight with Guilty Spark. If you've literally ever done this boss fight on any difficulty, you would know it's really not that hard to survive. You just kind of stand in the middle and try not to fall off or die. So After clearing out the boss fight, now the real tension happens in the level. The little navigation part before we get to the Warthog run. Fortunately, Thesis had a solid plan here. This is one that he had practiced a bunch, it worked really well, it was safe, nothing to worry about. Essentially, the plan is to let the Arbiter push up into the hallways, and the Arbiter will fight the Sentinels in the Flood, and all he has to do is just sit back and play it safe, and the Arbiter's stuck outside the map.
Where the f*** is Arbiter at?
See that doorway further on? Get to it.
How is he down there? Or is he just gonna sit there like a dumbass?
Alright, well, it's not like Thesis can use last checkpoint or anything in a run like this, so instead he has to just go on and YOLO it, and Thesis does. He goes, he fights without the Arbiter, kind of going in a little bit blind with this new strategy here, actually manages it really well, clearing out these hallways and pushing his way up finally to Johnson's Warthog. Now I will say this Warthog run only takes a couple of minutes. It's not overtly impossible, though if you don't know your routing, you can die easily, and there are still some things that can go wrong. But during the final minutes of this drive, the chat was going wild. Fans who had been watching this, even for a shorter amount of time, or just clicked on to see what was going on, kind of knew the significance of this Warthog run and how intense it was. There was no room for error, or else just like the previous runs, Thesis would be back onto Sierra 117. He pushes his way around the corner, and I think at that point, even Thesis knew that he had finally pulled something off that no player in all of Halo history has ever been able to do before.
It's done. It's f***ing done, dude. Oh my f***ing god.
Got it, Chief. Jump.
Easy.
For it. Find it.
Oh my f***ing god. Holy shit, dude. This f***ing game, the stupid panels, everything. I died to Cortana 7 motherfucking times, dude.
And with that, Thesis became the first ever player to beat Halo 3 Legendary All Skulls On in a single run without dying. But wait, the story doesn't end just like that. Firstly, Thesis immediately after being like, yeah, we did it, loaded up on Halo 2 and just dove right into LASO, just in the rare instance that his run in Halo 2, which he hasn't played since like a month earlier, would also be a successful LASO Deathless run, and then maybe he would try Combat Evolved and make it a trilogy Deathless run. That'd be crazy, right? No, it's not crazy, and that's the goal that Thesis has set for himself long term. At some point, Thesis wants to be able to be the first player to beat Halo Combat Evolved, Halo 2, and Halo 3 Legendary All Skulls On Deathless in a single segment. Now, it doesn't matter the order he does it in, but this is the goal that he's now working towards, and the next step in that goal is completing Halo Combat Evolved Legendary Deathless, and then from there he will either do the Halo Trilogy Legendary difficulty Deathless first before doing CE LASO Deathless, or the other way around. But having these goals coming up, like completing the Trilogy Legendary Deathless and then eventually the Trilogy LASO Deathless, is incredible. And I spent so much time watching Thesis on stream already, I can't recommend his channel even more. So if you want to watch him right now, more recently, he's been mapping out completing Legendary Deathless Combat Evolved, learning out that because eventually he's going to have to do that LASO. He's really pushing himself into Uncharted Challenge Run territory, and it is very well deserved. During the Moist Critical Challenge, Thesis apparently was on a vacation during like the biggest point of the challenge starting, and really came out of nowhere, making deep runs in Halo 2 LASO Deathless later on after there was a ton of coverage and people watching the other runners go for it and people getting rated and stuff who were going for the challenge. So Thesis was already very underappreciated or underrated back then with his skill level, and there really only are handfuls of players who even have these skill levels to be able to pull off challenge runs like this. Players like Jervalen or Thesis or Frazier. And with Frazier retiring from streaming, it only makes us appreciate these other types of runners who are trying to break the bounds and see what is even possible for players in these classic Halo titles. So I strongly recommend you go and check out Thesis's channel because you don't want to miss this journey as it unfolds. If I wasn't there for a lot of these runs, I'd be very confused trying to recap this, but I've had so much fun watching that this didn't feel like a job having to do a ton of research. Also, while I'm on the topic of Twitch, I've been streaming on Twitch, sometimes with Luke, sometimes by myself. We've been playing a lot of Halo content. I've been doing Acrophobia speedruns on there. So while you're on your way to follow Thesis, make sure you follow Rocket Sloth on Twitch too, maybe. That'd be kind of cool. And have your notifications on, because I stream at like really, really weird late hours, times you wouldn't think anybody would stream at. And if you're like me, then you're awake and you can hang out with us. This probably went on long enough, but this is a long video, so I can chat for a second. Anyways, thanks so much to all the support. Our patrons have been heroes of the storm. I think that's like a Dragon Force song, but I'm not 100% sure. Our patrons have been heroes of the storm. I think that's like a Dragon Force song, but I'm not 100% sure. It definitely has elements of a Dragon Force song, but thank you to our patrons for all of the support. If you feel like our content provides a level of content that you feel should be associated with a monetary value, you could always throw $1 to $2 our way and support us. You're kind of like a executive producer funding a project that they're passionate about or that they think's cool. And that'd be really cool, but thank you to all of our patrons, and we'll see you guys next time with a brand new video.